This is Post-Mortem. I'm Aidan Curry, producer of this podcast. Alex McKean will be your host. President Donald Trump signed an executive order on January 27th of this year, banning travelers from 7 predominantly Muslim countries from entering the United States. 2 days later, a shooting was carried out on a mosque in Quebec City. The original executive order was overturned by courts, subsequently rewritten, and overturned again. It remains an unresolved issue in the U.S. In this episode, Alex sits down with Dalia Hashim, president of the Muslim Students Association, to discuss how the U.S. travel ban has affected Muslim students at U of T.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about the President Donald Trump's travel ban, which was signed by executive order on January 27th, 2017. Mm-hmm. And it had a pretty major impact, not just in the United States, obviously, but here as well. I wanted to start off by asking you about when you heard about the travel ban, mm-hmm. and how you heard about it and what your reactions were. Mm-hmm. It was something that Donald Trump had talked about throughout mm-hmm. the campaign, mm-hmm. but this was different because it was put into an executive order. Mm-hmm. So what was your reaction to that when you heard about it?
I mean, I'd like to say surprised, but I wasn't too surprised. I think it was more really trying to understand the ramifications of that travel ban, because it's, it hadn't been exactly easy for Muslims to go through the border before the travel ban either way, just with the beginning of the Trump administration and, the whole xenophobia that surrounded that entire campaign. So when it came out, it was just trying to understand what that meant policy-wise, and then what that meant in direct ramifications for specific groups who wouldn't be allowed into the country. So I'd like to think about it in terms of like myself and my immediate family, but we're not as impacted as a Syrian refugee family who had packed their bags and was on their way. And so once you start hearing those stories emerge, that's when you really start fathoming the extent to which this travel ban is problematic and directly affects people's livelihoods. And so I think a lot of it was in the beginning just trying to understand what, where the ripples would mm-hmm. end, basically.
Yeah, for sure. So as president of the Muslim Students Association, I imagine that, there would have been people reaching out to you mm-hmm. and, talking to you about this just huge development that had occurred. Mm-hmm. What sorts of things were you hearing from students?
A lot of it had to do, we have a huge Somali community on campus, and a lot of those folks travel back and forth for like extended family who'd immigrated to the States instead of to Canada. A lot of people within the MSA body in general have family that's in the States or grew up in the States and decided to move to Canada or vice versa. And so it was just really listening to a lot of these stories and trying to understand how we can best serve those people and help them in their journey, even if it just meant, working with the chaplaincy, the Muslim chaplaincy on campus, mm-hmm. and trying to see, how we can best support students and how we can lend a helping ear and a listening ear to those various stories. And like as a policy student, I try really hard to also understand what it means policy-wise. So I was trying to follow that a little bit more, and be able to explain to folks who didn't entirely understand what the travel ban entailed, what were like the little intricacies that were associated with the travel ban. Mm-hmm. So just to make it clearer for folks as to who it applied to, who it didn't. And it was very difficult to do that actually in the like 1 or 2 weeks afterwards, because I don't think Americans themselves knew or the Canadian government knew what the travel ban entailed. So it was a little bit of it was just trying to keep up with the news as much as I could and translate it so that, folks who had questions, I'd try to answer it as best as I can. Right.
There was definitely a lot of uncertainty there.
Yeah.
And so people were coming to you for advice, for guidance on these things, whether it was going to impact them.
Yeah. And how it would. I mean, they might have listed 7 countries directly, right. But the underlying understanding was that it would affect all Muslims who were trying to cross the border. Whether you were born in Canada or born in, Russia, it didn't really matter as long as you looked or identified as Muslim, you were under extra scrutiny. And a lot of us, whether, the break was coming up, so a lot of people had plans to go to the States for a reading week. There's a lot of conferences that, U of T does in the States. So a lot of that is sort of under question.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And what were some of the stories that you heard from people when they came to you? You said you were lending a listening ear a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
What's something that really resonated with you? Something really salient that students told you?
I mean, one of our very active members actually has extended family in the States, and she was wondering. Not just if she could go visit them, because she wasn't directly from one of the member states that were listed,
mm-hmm.
but also what it meant for them. Her family is very active in the community, and they're very visible, and her siblings are considered leaders within the Muslim community, and that sort of visibility in the States right now became very, very problematic very, very quickly. And so to her, it wasn't just a question of, can I go back? It was the question of, is my direct family safe in the States? And a lot of folks, who immigrated here or grew up here knew that their parents immigrated here for additional safety that they were not able to find in their home countries. And so to have to question that again brings out a lot of trauma for a lot of people. And someone told me one day that they had forgotten that they were a refugee because they came here when they were so young. But the additional scrutiny and talks of, where are you from? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Sort of reminded her of all of that all over again. Mm. And so it awakened a lot of existing trauma that a lot of people had. And to me, that was very eye-opening. And it was very weighty. We talk about the travel ban, and a lot of the times in my classes or in my other social circles, we talk about the travel ban as being unfortunate, or as being an example of how Trump just doesn't get it, or how Trump is a president that is very, very different from his predecessors. But it's different when you turn that into stories and you turn that into real life situations for folks where you're like, this isn't going away today or tomorrow. Like we're gonna stop talking about the travel ban at some point. But this will continue being something that's central and a very central issue for a lot of folks for years to come. Because when policy changes, the ramifications of that is also how people view a certain minority as a result of that policy change. We can talk from here until the end of tomorrow about how Muslims aren't necessarily a threat. But when it's put in a policy that targets Muslims, in the back of people's minds, it's always going to be like, but why is it targeting only them? And is there an additional threat that we don't know about? And was the president briefed about something that we don't know about? And the answer to all of these questions is no, but I can keep saying no all I want, and it's not going to make a difference because there's a policy out there that specifies that everyone who identifies with this religion or who looks or has a different skin color should be under additional suspicion. And that's very, very tough to deal with, and that's very tough to explain to folks who deal with these as policy problems or policy issues. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's incredibly challenging and frustrating. It sounds like. And I wanted to ask about what you thought. So it seems like this travel ban is one thing. It's one policy. It's something that, but really it's taking something that is already pretty pervasive, right? This thing that already exists, this Islamophobic sentiment, and it's bringing it out into a more formalized sort of statement and a policy statement. So it sounds like a lot of what you're saying here is that people feel like this is not, it's not necessarily that it's new, it's that now it's policy.
Now it's okay.
Now it's okay.
Now it's okay. Now it's not you trying to be politically correct or trying to sort of subvert whatever understandings you have of Muslims. Now there's a policy that says that these people are suspicious for whatever reason. And so when you act on these suspicions, you're totally in the okay in the American administration's eyes. And that translates into a lot of things that we've seen in the last couple of months. That translates into the two Indians that were killed in at a bar in the States. You know, if you had any mild understanding of Islam, you know that, you know, Muslims generally don't drink. And so if you're targeting Muslims, the bar isn't exactly the best place to go.
Right.
But to that person, it didn't matter. They just looked brown. And so it starts sort of phasing out a lot of lines and making a lot of different things okay. And we've seen the ramifications of that with different communities. So it might have targeted Muslims, but it sort of unearthed a lot of xenophobia, a lot of anti-Semitism that was sort of festering
Right.
down below. And, you know, you see the Sikh community being targeted because people associate turbans with Muslims and they don't understand that there's a difference in religions there. You see, you know, the Jewish cemeteries that were targeted. You know, just today we're talking about the JCC down the street here getting a bomb threat.
Right.
And so it's no longer an American issue. It became a Canadian issue very, very quickly, with the shootings, with a whole bunch of things that have happened ever since. But it also became not just an anti-Muslim, Islamophobic sentiment. It became an anti-Semitic, xenophobic, racist. You know, at its root, I think what's missing from a lot of these conversations is that at its root, it started with Black racism. A lot of these questions started with Black racism. And because Black racism was left to fester and left to be okay for so long, there was just a lot of other layers that were added on there that were sort of okay now with this new administration and these new policies. So I think dealing with Islamophobia now has become a lot more complicated, but also a lot more of a solidarity work. So it's no longer the Muslim community working in a silo, and it never should have been, but, you know, or the indigenous community working in a silo, or the Black community. Right. It's become sort of a unified issue of an attack against the JCC's, attack against my community, an attack against the Black communities, an attack against my community. Not just because there's Black Muslims or, you know, indigenous Muslims or whatever. It's because these issues are at the root very, very related.
Right. That's an incredibly thoughtful response. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask, what should the administration, or maybe even more generally, the University of Toronto community, how should U of T here centrally respond to these issues?
Oh man, how much time do you have? No, I'm just kidding. I mean, there's a lot to be done there. The U of T community, I think, likes to talk a lot about equity and likes to talk a lot about all of these various issues as if we are immune to them, as if we have sort of passed that point of anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of that, and we can sort of preach to the world now what the rest of the world should be doing, or what the rest of even Toronto should be doing. You know, because U of T is like such an example. Whereas like when you go and talk to students, a lot of their immediate experiences of Islamophobia or, you know, any other sort of racism on campus started on campus, you know, and a lot of it has to do with folks who just haven't been educated otherwise. And, you know, when you don't feel the need to be educated on a certain topic, it becomes very difficult for me or any other group of students to sit you down and be like, not you, but like, I mean, right. The general you, and be like, this is what you need to do and this is why what you said was wrong. Because you yourself don't feel like there's a need to learn more there. And I feel like U of T lets us sit in that comfort a lot by virtue of being, you know, the Harvard of the North, by virtue of being a very exclusive university. We feel like if you were able to get here, you have a certain set of skills and understandings that warrant that you do not need to learn any further. And this goes not just to students, but to professors, to administration, you know, all throughout the university. There's very problematic things that are said in classes and that students don't feel comfortable responding to because you're one student in a class of 500 and, you know, getting up and refuting a professor is very, very difficult, let alone getting up and refuting a professor about something that is so deeply related to your identity, whether it's your religion or your race or whatever it is. And sometimes when folks go and talk to professors after class, you know, they get one of two responses. A, I didn't know, or B, well, we're an academic institution and this is free speech. Both of which are problematic. If you are a tenured professor at a school this big, then you should have received some form of equity training. You should have, you know, the school prides itself on its diversity, but what does it do in response to sort of back that up, or to say that we are accommodating for all of these diverse students? And, you know, there is the various pockets of institutional support. So we do get like a lot of support from like the Multi-Faith Center or various groups on campus, but it's not an institutionalized, uniform response when things like that happen. So
kind of
answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, so 2 days after the travel ban executive order was signed, there was a shooting in Quebec City, at a mosque in Quebec City. And 1 day after that, there was a vigil held here at U of T, and I believe you spoke at that vigil, is that correct? Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts about that gathering?
The vigil specifically? I mean, it was great to see the community come together. Obviously, it was a very quick turnaround of, you know, the shooting had happened the night before. A lot of people heard about it in the morning. And the vigil was a few hours after that, so it was in the evening at 6. And so to see folks come out so quickly, to see, you know, the minister, the mayor, various MPs want to speak and sort of show their support to the community is very, very important. And it was great to see that. But the next day we had a healing circle, which was sort of a chance for folks from the Muslim community to come out and just talk about their various feelings and not, you know, and find support in people who would understand what they're talking about or what they're going through. And we did it with the hopes that people would be able to talk about their feelings, and that's what they did. But neither myself or anyone on my team, I think, knew the extent of the hurt that a lot of people have that was unearthed by these shootings. And to us, it was very, very eye-opening. Even as students who, you know, quote unquote represent Muslims on campus, it was a time to discover that there's so much more work for us to do. And if anything, the shootings had, you know, brought back a lot of memories for a lot of people. And to them, like, you know, the comment that we kept hearing over and over again is that we've never been given the space to talk about the various things that we've undergone in a safe space, in a space that's welcoming. And so there's a lot of work to be done within the community to sort of support a lot of the hurt and the trauma that a lot of people have gone through, but also a lot of work to be done from, you know, outwardly in the community at U of T in Toronto, to sort of get folks to understand why these things happen and the fact that they're not coming from the middle of a void. That shooting was a culmination of something that was already there. It wasn't a one-off. Well, hopefully it is a one-off, but I mean, it wasn't a isolated incident that we can sort of just ignore and move on and be like, this is never going to happen again. Unless there's a response that's systematic. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of more Islamophobia and accordingly like anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and so on and so forth, not just in Quebec but across Canada, and this is confirmed only by the rise of very, very right-wing populist rhetoric in you know, the conservative race in Canadian politics in general that's being excused as free speech, but impacts folks very, very deeply and very readily in a way that I don't think a lot of people understand, to be honest.
So it sounds like the healing circle that was held and the vigil, these were, you know, pretty good efforts to respond to what had happened. It's now about a month later, a little bit more than a month later. Do you feel like that focus to fix this issue has waned at all, or is the energy still there?
I mean, it depends who you ask.
Right.
Has the energy in general across, Canada waned? I don't know. I wouldn't be able to sort of respond to that. But we've seen, it's interesting because just last Saturday there was an entire protest directed against Muslims and M103 and whatnot. And it comes, like M103 was in response to the shootings. And now you find folks going to protest in front of mosques, folks who are protesting, at the Nathan Phillips Square, all of that. So I don't know how much that pushes people to feel like we need to do more, or this is a controversial issue. We should probably not talk about it as much. So I don't know how this is going to settle down and how the dust will settle either way. I know that from within our team, and that's I guess the most that I can speak to. If anything, we're trying to work more, and we're trying to work across campus with various groups to make sure that the various things that we wanted to implement on campus do get implemented. Because when you're working with administration or when you're working with the students' union or other clubs, you need to continue, talking to them, continue reminding them of this is something that we really want to do. And we're hoping that this doesn't end with the end of the term this year, because it seems like things get forgotten really quickly over the summer. And because we're nearing exams and all of that, we're conscious of, the student timeline, and we are at the end of the day students, but we're trying very, very hard to put in the mechanisms to make sure that long-term plans are created to ensure that efforts against Islamophobia and racism on campus are not forgotten, and more importantly, are not tokenized. I'm very, very aware of the fact that it's election season on campus, and it's, the promises are grand and huge, but, it's more important to follow through too, and I'll assure you that the MSA will continue holding folks accountable to following through with these promises.
Right. Thank you for that insight. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you, or that you'd like to add?
I mean, there's another travel ban, so we're back to square one, it feels like, yes. with all of that. But it's Islam Awareness Week on campus, so hopefully that is a time for folks to come together and for folks to who don't know anything about Muslims to ask about Muslims. And our office is at 22 Sussex, office 503 or 505, sorry. We'd love to have anyone and everyone who wants to have a conversation, who wants to ask questions at our office. And we're don't shy away from asking questions, don't shy away from knowing more. Because I find folks a lot of the times feel bad asking questions, and it's no, just ask the question, just have that conversation. It might be a little bit difficult, but trust me, we'll feel a lot better afterwards. I had someone come up to me after the vigil, and they were like, I didn't quite understand why the Islamophobic videos that were released by SNC SU were Islamophobic. Can we talk about that? And I was like, for sure. We'll sit down, we'll talk, and I'll explain to you why they had the impact that they had. And so it's not a problem to ask. It's just a problem to go on not knowing. And not being aware of the impact of the things you say or the actions that you carry out. And so I'd encourage everyone to take some time and, have a conversation.
Okay. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks.
Post-Mortem is produced by me, Aidan Curry, for the Varsity's Features section. Video content is by Shaq Hossein. Alex McKean is our host. Stay tuned for more episodes as we delve into why top stories progressed the way they did and what they mean to students now. Thank you for listening.